Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Barbershops. Hello there, we're going to do a little investigating tonight and see how one of these institutions that we take so much for granted today found its way to the harbor. That's the story about every person who ever came to Grays Harbor, because off the beaten path as we are, there are mighty few folks who came here who weren't aiming this way when they rolled out and into town. No, that's one thing that can be said for Grays Harbor. It's made up of volunteers. It's not one of those whistle stops in the transcontinental line where you can kick off a train and find yourself somewhere that you hadn't planned to be. If you came to Grays Harbor to make it your home, the chances are pretty good that you had a reason for doing so. That's why the industries and businesses and most everyday things makes up the harbor. So let's find a way to came about here and how they get started and where they came from. Well, let's let Dick say a few words from our sponsor first, before we start to unreel the yarn about the harbor's first barbers and how they came to land here. Dick? You know, there was a time back in the early 1880s when the only barber shop on Grays Harbor was in Cosmopolis. We'll go into that particular situation and review that time in the harbor's history a little later when we tell you some of the recollections of the harbor pioneers like Joe Graham. But right here, let's take a look at the problem that was created by this failure of either Hoquiam or Aberdeen to boast a barber shop. It was in the days before either the cities were incorporated, and when the little sawmill, the Northwestern in Hoquiam, and the A.J. West and the J.M. Weatherwax mills in Aberdeen were about the only industry to anchor these towns too. If a man wanted a barber shop shave or a haircut, they had to get aboard a boat or row himself across the Chehalis and get up there to Cosmopolis. And there on Front Street, he could get his whiskers trimmed and his locks shorn. Otherwise, it was home clips, soup bowl jobs for everyone. Now, the man who is credited with getting Aberdeen out of that predicament and moving the barber business one city closer to Hoquiam was the late E.C. Finch, Ned Finch, the man who once talked of and who built the first skyscraper in town, or at least that's what the town folks called a skyscraper back in 1908. Ned Finch was a little on the dashing side in his younger days, as we related once, and he frequented the barber shop whenever he could locate one. He was in Olympia once on a promotional venture around 1887, and he sought out Fred Redinger's shop and had his stubble trimmed, and into the barber's ear he poured a well-developed Finch version of Grays Harbor. And when he got out of the chair, he had sold this area lock, stock, and barrel to the barber. You may wonder how a customer got in so much talking in a barber shop, but if you knew Ned Finch, it would be pretty clear. He was the most persuasive fellow, with a glib tongue, and he believed what he was selling, that Grays Harbor was the coming hub of the West Coast. And when he left Redinger's shop, the barber was ready to come to Grays Harbor. It was less than a month later that the barber showed up on the harbor, rented a corner in Andy's Cornet's grocery store, and installed a barber's chair. As the only barber in town and the only one that could be reached from Hoquiam on foot, he was soon doing a booming business. After a month, he built a small wooden building a few doors from the grocery store and put in 2 chairs. But there was still only one barber, and on Saturday night, when rush business lined the loggers and mill workers up 10 and 12 deep, one of the most handy of the customers would lather up the customers in one chair while the barber shaved them in the other chair. It was a mass production barbershop. Redinger was the town's only barber for some time. But in the months that followed, when the harbor was booming, Archie Macdougall came to town. Archie had been a drummer boy in the Union Army, and he was to play a heroic role in each 4th of July celebration for many years to come. However, his first job was less dramatic and more of a practical nature. He was also a barber. He set up a shop at the southeast corner of H and Heron Street, about where the State Liquor Store in Aberdeen is today. The shop was in front of the living quarters for himself and Mrs. Macdougall, and their residence was in the rear. Archie did right well as a barber and clipped a powerful lot of locks before a minor disaster took over his establishment. The Macdougall house was a narrow affair and a story and a half high. It stood up on the customary stilts that kept most of the buildings in Hoquiam and Aberdeen out of the water when the tides were high and flowed in. Thanksgiving Day that year brought a bit of a blow, and while Mrs. Macdougall was fixing the turkey and getting things ready for a fine holiday dinner, the winds gave the fragile building a terrific shake, and it quivered. The foundation slipped away and it toppled into the tide waters of the Heron Street swamp. Tables, chairs, turkey, stove, and Mrs. Macdougall all slid across the floor. The water rushed in and the Macdougalls were up to their waist in tide water when rescuers reached them. The foundation was restored, however, and Archie went right on cutting pioneer hair and trimming gay 90s whiskers. Another early barber was Billy Doddridge, who had been one of the crew at the A.J. West sawmills on the banks of the Wishkar River when the town first began to grow out of its primitive stage. Billy noted that barbering seemed to be a good thing, and that when he tried to get a clipping at Fred Redding's shop on a Saturday night, he sometimes had to wait an hour or two. So when he had been a handyman a few times at the Redding shop and had lathered while Fred shaved, he decided to take a hand at it. He scraped a few chins as an extra man for Redinger, then opening his own shop, which operated for nearly 40 years. My records don't indicate who put the first striped pole in Hoquiam and began to trim sideburns and handlebar mustaches, but among the early barber shops were Billy Beckwith's, Henry Mills, Ed Kansu's shop, while Horton and Kellogg's shop on what is now Simpson Avenue was quite a spacious establishment dedicated to the Tonsorial business of the harbor's earliest days. Harrison J. Rice also ran a shop in Hoquiam about the turn of the century and a line of shaving mugs, each marked with a customer's name, ran across the mirror on one side of his shop on I Street between 8th and 9th Street. It was in the early days after the towns became incorporated that barbershops really became institutions, and the town's politics was fought out and settled to the accompanying of clipping shears and the atmosphere of steaming towels. It was in these days when the barbershop was also a place where a logger could get a hot bath, which he felt he needed at least twice a year, when he rolled up into town on the 4th of July and at Christmas, often with a new suit of store-bought clothes over his arm. The barber would seek out his favorite barber and after a friendly greeting would stretch out in a tepid water of an old-fashioned bathtub and soak out the grime of a long stretch in the harbor's deep woods. The shop that Billy Doddridge in Aberdeen had before the fire, it was at 35 and a half Heron Street, had all the fancy equipment, and while it was a little short on plumbing, still the water was hot and clean, and the timber beast could head for Doddridge's as soon as he hit the city limits and come out of the place completely fit for society, with his whiskers trimmed or shorn completely, his hair newly cut, and that twice yearly soaking in hot water, if he was really going to cut a figure, trimmed up with some of Billy's Florida water that might be compared to dime store fragrance today, except that in the sawdust days of the harbor, it was a stamp of a diluted elegance. One of Aberdeen's best-known shops before and after the fire was Valentine Drake's Tonsorial Parlor, where sometimes as many as 4 chairs were filled at one time, and where the clatter of gossip and the snips of shears made a symphony of sound that once could be heard and would be remembered across for many years. It was there that doting mothers took their offspring for their first hair clipping ceremonies, and many a barbering tradesman soaked a beard there, as long ago made his mark in Grays Harbor hair cutting history. We're going to stop right here for a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsors before we get back to reminiscing. Dick? There was much to be said for the early self-sufficiency of these harbor towns in their early days. There wasn't much that they needed that they didn't or couldn't do for themselves. Aberdeen had a flour mill in the early 1900s, a foundry, a detective agency, a violin maker, and a cigar factory. Hoquiam had 2 cigar factories, and each city had one spot where ice cream was made and sold. The bread that people ate was made on Grays Harbor, the beer served across its many bars, and to a large degree as a local product. Shoes, men's suits, millinery, and women's dresses were made right here. And you could have a launch built, a fishing boat, or a seagoing schooner made here. You could have a wagon built, a bear stuffed, a book bound, or an engine babbited. Yes, they were self-sufficient people in those early settlers, and very few of them came to the harbor by chance, because Grays Harbor is not the sort of place that people gravitate to by accident. As we said a few minutes ago, we have something to do with the select quality of the folks that build these communities. For it was once said of them, all along the coast, that the people of Grays Harbor had more get up and go than those anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. Folks were pretty proud of that honor and have worked hard to keep it, the distinction, and it's one of the characteristics that we find securely recorded in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.